Quan Ryan never touched her, never spoke to her, and never looked at her until he saw another man's name glowing on her phone. After months of treating Zalika like a piece of high-end furniture, the husband who built an empire on ice suddenly wanted to burn the world down. But when he tried to replace her, as if she were nothing, Zalika did the one thing he never saw coming. She walked away, forcing a man who never claimed her to finally fight for what he only thought he owned. Welcome to the channel, Lovelies. Please like and subscribe. It was 11:47 p.m. when Zalika Moy made the mistake of leaving the guest wing. The penthouse hallway stretched before her, a cold bridge she crossed every night to avoid the man she was legally bound to. 12 weeks of marriage had become a ritual of avoidance dressed up as routine. But tonight, Quan Ryan was standing there, blocking her path to safety. In his hand was her phone. She didn't remember leaving it in the living room, and she certainly didn't remember him ever caring enough to notice anything she left behind. But the screen was lit. A message notification glowed like evidence at a crime scene, and his face, God, his face was a mixture of something she had never seen before. He didn't ask permission. He simply backed her against the wall, not violently, but inescapably. His broad-shouldered frame became a barrier between her and a door that represented the only peace she knew. Who is Daniel? His voice was low, controlled, and lethal. Confusion hit Zalika first, then a sharp jolt of recognition. Daniel, her ex-boyfriend from graduate school. Sweet Daniel, who existed in a world before contracts, cold shoulders, and sleeping alone in a mansion full of expensive things, but empty of warmth. That's none of your business, she whispered. Ryan's grip tightened on the phone. Not on her. Never on her, because that would require acknowledging she was something worth touching. He read aloud, each word a small detonation in the quiet hallway. I still think about what we had. If you ever need anything, I'm here. He looked at her, and she saw something dangerous swimming beneath the ice of his dark eyes. How long? He demanded. How long have you been talking to him? The silence that followed was suffocating. The hallway felt smaller. She could see the vein in his neck pulsing, and could count her own frantic heartbeats in the space between them. His jaw clenched, and she waited for the eruption. Answer me, he growled. And finally, something inside Zalika broke. Not gently, not quietly. One text. Just one. The merger was never about a union of souls. It was a cold, calculated collision of two empires. On one side stood Quan Ryan and M Group, the silent architects of Seoul's most powerful distribution routes. On the other, Zalika Moy and her father's Nigerian oil magnates, a dynasty with deep roots in African resources and European political ties. The logic was simple. Asian distribution plus African resources equaled an unstoppable global empire. The bore of M Group had been blunt with Ryan. At 34, his bachelorhood was a liability to shareholders who questioned his stability. The command was clear, marry the Moy girl. Zalika had been told a different version of the same lie. She was promised protection and told that the marriage would make her family's crippling European debts vanish. She walked into the contract signing as an elegant sacrifice, her dark skin luminous against a structured dress, her hair adorned with gold accessories that whispered of the wealth she was being traded for. When she signed her name in confident, sweeping strokes and looked up at Ryan with intelligent, searching eyes, something in his chest had moved. But in his world, movement was a weakness. He buried the flicker of attraction instantly, convincing himself that indifference was the only way to maintain his strength. The wedding that followed was a sterile, private affair. There were no heartfelt vows, only standard lines recited by Ryan in a flat monotone that drained the ceremony of any remaining color. In the car afterward, he didn't offer her a hand or a kind word. Instead, he looked at her with eyes like flint and told her he didn't believe in love, that this was strategy, and she should never expect anything more. Zalika had nodded, braced by her father's warnings of his coldness, yet she was entirely unprepared for his absolute absence. What followed were 12 weeks of ritualized avoidance dressed up as routine. They lived in the same sprawling penthouse, yet they were ghosts to one another. They kept separate bedrooms because it was practical. Zalika would spend hours in the kitchen preparing dinners that he would inevitably eat at his office. claiming he had meetings. Whenever she attempted to bridge the gap with conversation, he would check his watch and find an excuse to disappear. Even when his own brother asked about the prospect of children, Ryan's only response was that it would happen when it was strategically viable. Zalika slowly stopped trying. She began to shrink within the gilded cage of the penthouse, staying in her room for days at a time, realizing that her husband didn't even notice her disappearance. She was a Nigerian heiress and an MBA graduate, but in the halls of Kwan Ryan's home, she was just an arrangement, a living contract whose presence was required at family dinners, but whose heart was never invited to the table. She was drowning in the silence in a house full of expensive things, but entirely empty of warmth, becoming a stranger in her own marriage before the first 3 months had even passed. The silence of the penthouse had its own weight, a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to steal the oxygen from the room. For 12 weeks, Zalika had lived within that silence, moving to the marble halls of Kwan Ryan's world like a ghost haunting a museum of her own life. The mansion was a masterpiece of cold glass and sharp angles, filled with artifacts of immense value, yet it remained entirely empty of warmth. While Ryan commanded empires and navigated the lethal currents of the soul underworld, Zalika was left to navigate the vast, quiet desert of her own isolation. She spent her afternoons in the glass-walled garden, reading books she had already finished and watching the city lights flicker to life, realizing that her husband's absence was more than just physical. Even when he was home, he was gone, his gaze sliding over her as if she were a shadow on the wall. She had become a master of the solitary walk, the nightly ritual of moving from their shared living space to her lonely bedroom, a bridge she crossed every night in a house that felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage. The isolation had begun to erode her spirit, making her forget what it felt like to actually matter to another human being. It was during one of these nights, while sitting in the oppressive stillness of the living room during Ryan's 72-hour disappearance, that her phone finally vibrated. The name on the screen, Daniel, felt like a lifeline thrown from a previous life, a world before cold shoulders and ironclad contracts. Daniel had been the man who brought her coffee during finals and looked at her with a softness that Ryan refused to acknowledge existed. His message was simple, a quiet echo of a time when she was seen, "I still think about what we had. If you ever need anything, I'm here." In her vulnerability, she hadn't deleted it. She hadn't even hidden it. She had simply looked at the words and allowed herself to remember a version of Zalika that wasn't a business transaction. She hadn't realized she had left the phone on the mahogany coffee table when she retreated to her room. She hadn't expected Ryan to return in the middle of the night, driven by a restless energy he refused to name. But when he saw the screen light up, when he saw another man offering the very warmth he had spent months withholding, the ice in his veins finally shattered. It wasn't love that ignited his fury. It was a primal, predatory sense of ownership. The woman he had treated like furniture was suddenly a prize being eyed by a rival. He stood in the darkened hallway, the phone glowing in his hand like evidence at a crime scene, waiting for her to emerge from her solitary wing. When she finally stepped into the hallway at 11:47 p.m., she didn't find the indifferent stranger she had married. She found a man whose control had vanished, replaced by a lethal, jealous obsession that was about to burn their quiet ritual to the ground. The morning after the confrontation in the hallway, the air in the penthouse didn't clear. It thickened with a new, predatory tension. Kwan Ryan did not apologize for backing Zalika against the wall, nor did he mention the name Daniel again. Instead, he pivoted to a more surgical form of warfare. When Zalika descended the stairs for breakfast, she found a stranger seated at the head of the long obsidian dining table, a woman with razor-sharp features, hair pulled back into a clinical bun, and a suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. "This is Park Me," Ryan said, his voice as flat as a blade, not bothering to look up from his tablet. "She is my new tactical partner. From today, she will be handling all internal communications and logistical oversight for the William Group merger." Zalika froze, her hand tightening on the back of a chair. "I thought I was the liaison for my family's interests." Ryan finally looked at her, but his eyes were devoid of the fire she had seen the night before. He had retreated behind a wall of professional ice. "You were a placeholder, Zalika, but recent events suggest you are distracted." Park Me is a professional. You are a civilian. It's better this way. You can return to your books and your garden. You no longer need to trouble yourself with the business of this marriage. The insult was calculated and precise. By introducing Park Me, Jerry Ryan wasn't just bringing in an assistant. He was implementing a replacement strategy designed to strip Zalica of her last shred of purpose. For the next week, the ritual of avoidance evolved into a ritual of erasure. Everywhere Zalica went, Park Me was there, a silent shadow occupying the spaces Zalica used to fill. At dinner, Jerry Ryan discussed shipping manifests and port security with Park Me in rapid-fire Korean, intentionally bypassing the English they usually spoke. Zalica sat at the same table, a Nigerian queen reduced to a background character in her own home. She watched as Jerry Ryan handed Park Me documents he used to keep locked in his safe. He treated the newcomer with a level of professional respect he had never afforded his wife, intentionally performing a charade of intimacy that was strictly intellectual but deeply personal in its exclusion. Every time Zalica tried to contribute a point regarding her father's oil refineries, Jerry Ryan would cut her off with a dismissive wave of his hand. Park Me has already drafted the report, Zalica. There's no need for you to strain yourself. It was a psychological siege. He was punishing her for the Daniel text by showing her exactly how replaceable she was. He wanted her to feel the coldness of the world without its protection, to see that in the hierarchy of the Quan Empire, she was lower than a consultant. He waited for her to beg for her position back, to cry, or to explain the text. But as she watched Park Me slide into her chair in the home office, Zalica realized this wasn't just a business move. It was a cage made of shadows, and Jerry Ryan was the one holding the key, watching from behind his desk to see when his furniture would finally break under the weight of being invisible. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological exile. In the high-stakes world of the Quan Syndicate, information was the only currency that mattered, and Jerry Ryan was systematically bankrupting Zalica of her access. He transformed the penthouse from a home into a war room, one where Zalica no longer held a clearance level. She became a spectator to the life she was supposed to be leading, watching from the fringes as Park Me seamlessly navigated the territory disputes that had once been whispered about in the shadows. Zalica would often find him in the glass-walled study, the air thick with the scent of bitter espresso and expensive tobacco. Maps of the Incheon docks and satellite feeds of West African shipping lanes were sprawled across the mahogany desk, territories that represented the union of their two families. Before the text from Daniel, Zalica had been told these matters were too volatile for her involvement. Now, she watched Park Me point a laser at a disputed terminal in Lagos, her voice steady and clinical as she discussed neutralizing a rival distributor. Jerry Ryan would lean in, his sharp jawline tight with focus, nodding at Park Me's suggestions with professional intimacy that felt like a physical blow to Zalica's chest. The erasure was most brutal during the formal business dinners. These were no longer the quiet, awkward meals of the past 12 weeks. They were tactical sessions. Park Me sat in the chair that should have belonged to the lady of the house, her fingers dancing over a tablet as she translated complex legal jargon and subtext for Jerry Ryan. When Zalica tried to enter the room, the conversation wouldn't stop, but the eye contact would. Jerry Ryan would simply slide a stack of files over to Park Me, his movements efficient and cold, treating Zalica as if she were a ghost haunting the corridors of his power. She watched as Park Me was granted the keys to the inner sanctum, the logistics of the oil transport, the security protocols for the M Group fleet, and the direct line to the Moy family's European lawyers. It was a calculated display of what Zalica could have been if Jerry Ryan had ever chosen to trust her. Instead, he was using her exclusion to punish her, show her that he could find a partner who understood his darkness without the distractions of a past life. By the end of the second week, the silence was no longer passive. It was aggressive. Zalica felt herself fading. Her presence in the mansion reduced to the sound of her heels on marble, a sound that neither Jerry Ryan nor Park Me ever turned to acknowledge. She was witnessing the total colonization of her role, watching another woman master the very empire she had been sacrificed to build. Every time Park Me's sharp Korean vowels filled the room, replacing the English Zalica spoke, it was a reminder that in Jerry Ryan's world, she was being erased from the map, one territory at a time. The man who had once ignored her out of indifference was now ignoring her with a lethal, focused intent. proving that in his house, the only thing more dangerous than his silence was his attention directed at someone else. The transition was not a dramatic exit, but a slow, quiet receding of a tide. Zalika realized that you cannot decorate a void, nor can you breathe life into a man who prefers a company of cold iron and calculated silence. She stopped placing fresh flowers in the foyer. She stopped asking the kitchen staff to prepare the jollof rice whose spices Jerian had always pointedly ignored. The penthouse, once a place she tried to soften with her presence, returned to its natural state, a high-altitude vault of glass and steel. One rainy Tuesday, without a word of explanation or a formal request, Zalika packed 2 suitcases with her essentials and moved across the manicured rooftop garden to the detached guest wing. It was a space designed for visitors who never came, a smaller, simpler sanctuary that Jerian hadn't touched with his shadow. By physically removing herself from the main house, she was finally aligning her body with the emotional distance he had spent 12 weeks perfecting. In the guest house, the air felt lighter. She could play her music without feeling like a nuisance. She could sleep without listening for the heavy, rhythmic click of his dress shoes on the marble outside her door. She was reclaiming her territory, even if that territory was only a single bedroom and a small kitchenette. She was no longer a ghost in his halls. She was a sovereign in her own exile. For 3 days, Jerian didn't notice. He was too insulated by his schedules and the sharp, efficient presence of Parkme. But on the 4th night, the silence of the main penthouse began to change shape. It was no longer the silence he had curated. It was a hollow, echoing vacuum. He returned home late, his tie loosened and his mind still churning with dockside disputes, and realized the lights in the master wing were completely dark. There was no scent of vanilla or shea butter lingering in the hallway. There was no soft sound of a page turning in the library. He walked toward the guest wing, his pace quickening with an irritation he couldn't quite justify. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the garden path, he saw a single amber light glowing in the distance. Zalika was sitting on the small patio of the guest house, her silhouette framed by the city skyline. She wasn't waiting for him. She wasn't looking at the main house. She was simply existing, entirely separate from him. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the solar plexus. He had spent weeks trying to erase her, to punish her for a text by showing her she was replaceable. But as he stood in the cold darkness of his empty living room, looking at the distant, warm light of her new sanctuary, he realized he hadn't erased her. He had pushed her out of his reach. The furniture had walked away, and for the first time in his life, Quan Jerian understood the difference between a house he controlled and a home he had lost. The predatory focus that had once been used to ignore her was now locked onto the small, glowing light of the guest house, fueled by a mounting, frantic need to bridge the distance he had created. The storm that had been brewing in the guest wing finally broke on a Thursday evening, though not with thunderclap, but with a whisper. Zalika had returned to main house, not to reclaim her place, but to retrieve a set of journals she had left in the library, records of her family's oil production history that she refused to leave in Jerian's cold custody. The penthouse was unnaturally quiet, the usual hum of staff replaced by the low, urgent murmur of voices coming from the partially open mahogany doors of Jerian's study. She should have kept walking. She should have taken her books and retreated to her sanctuary. But her own name, spoken in Jerian's sharp, unmistakable baritone, anchored her to the shadows of the hallway. "The test is over, Jerian," a woman's voice said. It wasn't the clinical, professional tone Zalika had heard for the last 2 weeks. It was relaxed, weary, and laced with familiar exasperation. "I've played the part of the ambitious replacement for 14 days. I've sat at your table, handled your logistics, and endured your wife's heartbreak. If you wanted to see if she would break, you have your answer. She didn't break, she left." Zalika's breath hitched. She pressed her back against the cool marble wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "She didn't just leave, Parkme," Jerian replied, his voice sounding raw, stripped of its usual armor. "She stopped looking for me. I thought if I showed her how easily I could replace her, she would explain the text. I thought she would fight for her position. Instead, she just vanished into that guest house. Because you treated her like a rival gang member instead of your wife," the woman snapped. I'm your cousin, Jerian. I grew up with you. I know you use silence as a weapon, but using me to make her feel like a civilian in her own home was cruel. Even for you. You were so jealous of a ghost from her past that you decided to haunt her yourself. The revelation was a physical detonation in Zalika's chest. The tactical partner, the woman who had mastered her territories and sat in her chair, was his blood. The entire 2 weeks of systematic erasure hadn't been a business necessity. It had been an elaborate, cruel psychological experiment. He had paraded his own family before her as a threat to see if she still cared enough to be jealous. He had weaponized her insecurity to soothe his own bruised ego. A cold, clear anger began to rise through the shock, replacing the lingering traces of her hurt. She realized then that Jerian didn't just lack love. He lacked the basic respect required to view her as a human being rather than a strategic asset to be tested and manipulated. Inside the room, the silence grew heavy. "What do I do now?" Jerian asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You can't win this with a contract, and you can't win it with a lie," Parkme said, her footsteps echoing as she moved toward the door. "You lost her the moment you decided to play a game with her heart. Now you'll have to see if there's anything left to save." Zalika didn't wait for the door to open. She turned and walked away, her footsteps silent on the expensive rugs. She didn't go to the library. She didn't go to the guest house. She walked straight toward the elevators, the revelation of his betrayal fueling a transformation he never saw coming. The test was over, but for Zalika, the real war for her dignity had just begun. The cold weight of the revelation didn't slow Zalika down. It acted as a catalyst, sharpening her resolve into a diamond edge. She didn't return to the guest house to hide. Instead, she walked back into the main study, her heels striking the marble with a rhythmic finality that silenced the conversation between Jerian and Parkme. Jerian stood as she entered, his eyes widening with a flicker of hope that died the moment he saw her expression. It wasn't the look of a woman seeking an explanation. It was the look of a judge delivering a verdict. "The test is over, Jerian," she said, her voice vibrating with a calm power that filled the room. "And you failed." Parkme took one look at Zalika's face, offered a small, respectful nod of apology that went unacknowledged, and quietly slipped out of the room. The door clicked shut, leaving the husband and wife in a silence that felt like the air before a terminal crash. "Zalika, listen to me," Jerian began, taking a step toward her. "The text, I didn't know how to handle the thought of you looking elsewhere. I needed to know if you were still committed to this union. This isn't a union, Jerian. It's a siege," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "You didn't want to know if I was committed. You wanted to see how much of my dignity you could strip away before I broke. You used your own cousin to mimic my replacement because you were too cowardly to ask me if I was lonely. You wanted to own me, but you never wanted to know me. I protected your family," he growled, his voice dropping into that lethal Mafia register. "The Noid debts are being cleared because of my name. If you walk away now, the banks will descend on your father within 24 hours. You are bound to me by more than just a ring." Zalika looked at the gold band on her finger, the symbol of her family's financial salvation and her own emotional incarceration. Without a word, she twisted it off. The metal made a sharp, lonely sound as she dropped it onto a mahogany desk. "Then let them descend," she said. "My father would rather be a poor man with a daughter who respects herself than a billionaire whose child is treated like a tactical asset. You thought the debt was your leash, Jerian. But I would rather spend the rest of my life paying back every cent than spend one more night wondering if my husband is running a psychological experiment on me." The shock on his face was absolute. In his world, everything had a price, and he had assumed he had paid enough to keep her. He hadn't accounted for the fact that Zalika Amari Nwoy was a woman who could not be bought, only earned. "You can't just leave," he whispered, the first cracks of genuine panic appearing in his polished exterior. "The contract." "Burn the contract," she said, turning toward the door, "because I am already gone." As she walked out of the penthouse, she didn't look back at the luxury, the glass, or the man standing in the center of his empty empire. She walked toward the elevator, leaving behind the gilded cage and the gold-twisted lies. For the first time in 12 weeks, she wasn't breathing the recycled air of transaction. She was breathing the cold, sweet air of her own freedom. She had chosen herself. And in doing so, she had left the powerful Quan Ryan with nothing but the silence he had so carefully cultivated. The silence that followed Zalika's departure was not the peaceful. Controlled, quiet Quan Ryan had spent his life perfecting. It was a hollow, ringing void that made the vast penthouse feel like a tomb. For the first few hours, he sat at his mahogany desk, staring at the gold ring she had abandoned, waiting for the familiar surge of cold logic to return. He expected to feel the clinical resolve of a CEO preparing for a legal battle. Instead, he felt an alien, gnawing ache in his chest, a phantom limb where a person he had spent 12 weeks ignoring used to be. Driven by a restless, frantic energy, he walked into the guest wing. He hadn't expected to find anything. Zalika was too meticulous to leave evidence of her life behind. But tucked beneath the mattress of the guest bed was a small, leather-bound notebook he had never seen before. It wasn't a ledger of debts or a collection of contacts. It was a diary, a chronicle of her drowning. As he opened the first page, the elegant rhythmic script felt like a voice speaking from the shadows. He began to read, and for the first time, the furniture began to bleed. Week 4, one entry read, "Today he looked through me as I poured his coffee. I wonder if I am becoming transparent. I spoke about the Lagosport expansion, and he checked his watch. I am not a wife. I am a ghost in a house of glass. I think if I stopped breathing, the air in this room wouldn't even ripple." Ryan flinched as if struck. He flipped forward, his eyes scanning the pages as the tone shifted from lonely to desolate. He saw his own coldness reflected back at him through her eyes. He saw the ritual of avoidance for what it truly was, a slow, systematic execution of a woman's spirit. Week 9, another entry whispered, "The silence is so loud it makes my ears ring. I find myself touching the walls just to feel something solid. He thinks he is protecting my family, but he is burying me alive. I would trade every diamond in this safe for a single moment where he looks at me and sees a human being instead of a contract." The final entries, written during the 2-week test, would part me with the hardest of stomach. They were shorter, the handwriting frantic and shaky. "He brought another woman into our home today. He looks at her when she speaks. He listens. The erasure is almost complete. I am officially a civilian in my own life. It isn't the jealousy that hurts. It's the realization that he thinks so little of my heart that he believes a charade could fix us." Ryan closed the book, his hands trembling. He looked around the room, seeing the breaking in slow motion he had presided over with such arrogant pride. He had been so focused on the Daniel text, a single moment of external threat, that he had completely missed the internal collapse of the woman he was supposed to cherish. He had spent months building walls of ice to protect his heart, only to realize he had used those same walls to crush hers. In the quiet of the guest wing, the ruthless Mafia boss finally understood his greatest failure. He had won the territory, but he had utterly destroyed the inhabitant. For the first time, Quan Ryan didn't reach for his phone to call his lawyers. He sat in the dark, clutching a diary of pain, finally beginning to feel the weight of the woman he had lost. The transformation of Quan Ryan did not begin with a grand gesture, but with a systematic dismantling of the very world he had used to cage Zalika. For years, he had operated on the philosophy that love was a liability and control was the only true currency. But as he sat alone in the silent penthouse, the weight of her diary still heavy in his mind, he realized that his empire was nothing but a graveyard of his own making. The Mafia boss was a mask that had finally suffocated the man beneath it. His first act of penance took place in the center of his high-tech study. He pulled the ironclad marriage contract from his safe, the document that had turned Zalika into a strategic asset and tied her family's survival to his whims. He didn't call his lawyers to discuss exit clauses or financial penalties. Instead, he struck a silver lighter and held the flame to the corner of the thick parchment. He watched as the legal jargon, the terms, the conditions, the cold obligations, curled and blackened, turning into gray ash that drifted onto the mahogany desk. By burning the contract, he was unilaterally stripping himself of his leverage. He was making her free, even if it meant she would never choose to return. Next, he turned his focus to the security that had acted as Zalika's invisible wardens. He summoned the elite team of monitors and bodyguards to the foyer. These were men who would track her movements, log her visitors, and ensured she remained a prisoner of his protection. "You are all relieved of your duties," Jerian announced, his voice lacking its usual lethal edge, replaced instead by a weary finality. "Sir?" the head of security asked, confused. "Our contract with M Group is terminated." Jerian interrupted. "Zalika is no longer a subject of this house. She is a private citizen. From this moment forward, there will be no surveillance, no reports, and no interference in her life. If I find that a single one of you has followed her or looked into her affairs, you will answer to me personally. Clear the equipment out by dawn." As the men scrambled to dismantle the cameras and sensors that had turned the penthouse into a panopticon, Jerian felt a strange, terrifying lightness. He was dismantling the infrastructure of his own power. He was firing the people who gave him his eyes, because he finally realized he had been blind to the only thing that mattered. He spent the rest of the night personally deleting the digital logs of her life from the central server. He scrubbed the data points, the GPS histories, and the recorded conversations. He was giving her back her privacy, bit by bit. When the sun began to rise over the Seoul skyline, the penthouse was no longer a fortress. It was just a house. Jerian stood by the window, no longer the untouchable king of a distribution empire, but a man who had finally burned down his own throne. He had dismantled the boss to find a husband, and now, with no contract to bind her and no guards to watch her, he had to face the most frightening prospect of all, waiting to see if a free woman would ever want to see him again. The restaurant was not one of the usual Mafia haunts. No private back rooms, no armor glass, and no bowing staff who knew Jerian's name. It was a small, vibrant Nigerian bistro in a quiet corner of the city, a place filled with the scent of ground clothes and Scotch bonnet peppers. Jerian sat at a modest wooden table, looking entirely out of place in his charcoal suit, his hands clasped tightly to hide the slight tremor in his fingers. When Zalika walked in, she didn't look like a woman in hiding. She looked like a woman who had finally found her breath. She sat across from him, refusing to let him pull out her chair. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the air between them hummed with a new, dangerous electricity. Jerian pushed a folder across the table, but Zalika didn't open it. "If that's a new contract, take it back," she said, her voice steady and cool. "It's the title deeds to your family's holdings," Jerian replied, his voice raspy. "Unconditional. There are no signatures required from you. I've settled the European debts as a gift, not a loan. You are free, Zalika. You owe me nothing." Zalika looked at the folder for a long moment, then looked him directly in the eyes. "Then why am I here, Jerian?" "Because I read the diary," he admitted. "The words sounded like confession of a crime. And I realized that while I was busy protecting the world from you, I was the one you needed protection from. I don't want to own you anymore. I want to know you. If you'll let me." Zalika leaned forward, the light from the table's candle reflecting in the gold of her earrings. "You want to know me? Then you need to understand that the woman who lived in your penthouse is dead. If there is to be any U.S., it will be on my terms. Not a negotiation, Jerian. Conditions." She laid them out with the precision of a general. "First, the silence ends. No more strategic secrets. If you're at war, I know about it. If you're afraid, you tell me. Second, Park me or any other family member never plays a role in our private lives again. Third, I return to my work. I am a partner in the Moyam Group expansion, or I am nothing at all. And finally," she paused, her gaze boring into his, "you earn my time, every dinner, every conversation, every touch. You don't get to assume my presence just because we share a name." Jerian listened to each point, his jaw tight. In the past, he would have seen these terms as a threat to his authority. Now, he saw them as a map out of the desert. He realized she wasn't asking for power. She was asking for humanity. "I accept," he said. The two words carried more weight than the vows they had taken months ago. "But I have one condition of my own." Zalika tilted her head, her expression guarded. "What?" "That you tell me when I'm failing," he whispered. "Don't drown in silence again. If I start to turn back into that man, scream. Burn the house down if you have to. Just don't disappear." Zalika looked at him, really looked at him and saw the latent volcano had finally erupted, leaving behind something raw and honest. She didn't reach for his hand, not yet, but she didn't get up to leave. She picked up the menu, a small, subtle signal that for the first time in their marriage, they were actually going to have a conversation. The 5 months that followed were not a period of grand, sweeping reunions, but a disciplined exercise in reconstruction. Quan Jerian understood that trust was a glass palace he had shattered with a single hammer blow. He couldn't simply glue the shards back together. He had to melt them down and forge something new. To do this, he began a radical restructuring of his existence, moving with the same clinical precision he once used for corporate takeovers. But this time, the target was his own character. He became a man of the weekly proof. Every Sunday evening, precisely at 7 p.m., Zalica would receive a single text. They weren't the desperate, pleading messages of a broken man, nor were they the demanding commands of a mafia boss. They were progress reports. 1 week, it was a photo of the completed legal dissolution of the surveillance unit. Another week, it was a confirmation that he had attended his 4th consecutive session with a specialist in emotional trauma, a man who was helping Jerian understand that control was just a mask for fear. He didn't ask for a reply. He didn't demand her time. He simply showed her that he was doing the work he had promised at the bistro. He was proving that the furniture had been replaced by a human being who was learning how to speak a language other than power. The most significant shift, however, occurred within the ironclad walls of the Quan family council. For years, the elders had praised Jerian's marriage to the Moy heiress as a successful acquisition. But when Zalica moved into her own apartment and reclaimed her independence, the whispers began. At a formal lunar dinner, seated beneath the heavy crystal chandeliers of the family estate, his mother had leaned in, her voice a sharp, polished weapon. The African girl is an embarrassment, Jerian. She has abandoned her post. The merger is secure. It is time to find a wife who understands the silence of our house. Jerian didn't flinch. He didn't lower his gaze. He set his chopsticks down with a click that silenced the table. Zalica did not abandon her post, he said, his voice echoing with a new kind of authority, one that didn't rely on threats, but on absolute conviction. She left a man who didn't deserve her. And as for this house, the silence you love so much is exactly what was killing us. If you speak of her with anything less than the respect due to a partner of M Group, and as a woman I am trying to earn the right to love, you will find yourself excluded from every board meeting I chair. She is not a placeholder. She is a standard. The public defense of his wife against the very people who had forged him was the ultimate proof. He was no longer a mafia boss playing a game of jealousy. He was a man dismantling his own legacy to build a future. He spent 5 months in a solitary discipline of growth, sending his weekly signals into the dark, waiting for the day Zalica might decide that the man he was becoming was finally worth the risk of a real conversation. He had learned that true power wasn't in holding someone captive, but in becoming a man who gave them every reason to stay. The penthouse was no longer a vault of recycled air and sterile marble. It had been transformed by the presence of sunlight, open windows, and a silence that felt peaceful rather than predatory. There was no gold-twisted contract sitting in the safe, and no security team lurking in the shadows to log Zalica's movements. The only document that mattered was a simple, handwritten invitation to a second ceremony, one held not in a cold corporate hall, but in the small, vibrant bistro where they had first rewritten the terms of their lives. This wedding was a quiet revolution. There were no lawyers present to witness the merger of assets, only a few close friends and the soft, rhythmic sounds of a Nigerian high-life band playing in the corner. When Jerian stood before Zalica, he didn't look like the iron-fisted leader of a global syndicate. He looked like a man who had finally learned that vulnerability was the ultimate form of strength. He didn't promise to protect her as if she were a fragile asset. He promised to respect her as a sovereign partner. When he slipped a new ring onto her finger, a simple, unadorned band of Nigerian gold, he whispered for words that carried more weight than all the billions in his bank account. Every day, I choose you. The transition from a marriage of strategy to a marriage of choice changed the very molecular structure of their home. The guest wing was repurposed into an art studio for Zalica, and the obsidian dining table, once a site of psychological warfare, became a place of laughter and heated debates about the future of their joint ventures. Jerian had dismantled the boss, but in his place, he had found a husband who knew how to listen. 2 years later, the final piece of their reconstruction arrived. Her name was Amara, a name that meant grace in Zalika's native tongue. Jerian stood in the nursery, the city lights of Seoul glittering through the glass behind him. He held the tiny, sleeping girl against his chest, her deep skin a beautiful contrast to his own. He thought back to the man he had been, the man who had backed his wife against a wall over a text message, blinded by a toxic need for ownership. He looked at Zalika, who was leaning against the doorframe watching them, and realized that he hadn't just saved his marriage. He had saved his soul. He had tried to own her and had almost lost everything. She had chosen herself and had given him a chance to start over. As Amara stirred in his arms, reaching out a small hand to grasp his finger, Jerian understood that this was the only kingdom worth ruling. There were no contract to bind them, no debts to enforce their loyalty, and no walls to keep them apart. There was only a family built on choice, a love earned through respect, and a happy ending that was no longer transaction, but a living, breathing reality. He looked at Zalika and smiled, knowing that for the first time in his life, he didn't need to be in control to be truly powerful. If you love dark romance stories where boundaries matter and power is challenged, subscribe now and comment below. Did he deserve another chance?